بين النور والظلماء شتان بين الرشد والإغواء شتان بين فتاة دين
لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. عباد الله, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to this class on the biography of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. We've had a break from these classes for a while, and when we finished off a few weeks ago, we were talking mostly about the apostate wars and stuff like that. So, inshallah, what we're going to do today, Jazakumullahu khairan. What we're going to do today, we'll just start off, inshallah, with a brief summary of the last session that we had about a month ago, just to bring us up to speed on the topic. And we had been talking about the apostate wars and how after the Muslim army had completely secured the inside of the Garden of Death at the Battle of Al-Yamama, Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, he decided to attack Yamama's fortresses, not knowing at the time that the only people left inside them were just women, children, and old men. Consequently, Muja'a, the leader of the tribes there, he tricked Khalid into agreeing to a truce. But even if Khalid was deceived, what happened in the end was in the best interests of the Muslims. And the Muslims, they gained control of Banu Hanifa's land, and many Banu Hanifa tribesmen, they returned back to the fold of Islam. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he forgave Khalid, judging him to be innocent of any wrongdoing in the situation, especially as a group from the Quraysh spoke out in favor of Khalid's integrity. In reality, Khalid radiallahu anhu, he didn't have any delusions of grandeur. He didn't feel that he was entitled to any sort of special privileges. Rather, he was a warrior worshipper, a true believer who had faith in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He fought not for glory or power, but in order to raise the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above all else. For his efforts, he desired no worldly reward, and he expected neither gratitude nor recognition from any other human being. In that previous session, we also talked about the gathering of the Holy Quran, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he was very saddened at the loss of 1,200 eminent companions in the Battle of Al-Yamama. When the tragic news reached Medina that many memorizers of the Quran had been killed at Al-Yamama, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he went to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu saying that because the Quran was in the hearts of men, and if the men die, the Quran might be lost. So why don't you compile the Quran into one book? Consequently, Zayd ibn Thabit al-Ansari radiallahu anhu, he was given the heavy task of compiling the Quran into one book. He said, I had to go around collecting the Quran from the hearts of men and collect all of the manuscripts that existed on palm leaves, flat rocks, shoulder bones of camels, and pieces of leather. And then I compiled the Quran. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he gave a lot of thought to the matter before he put Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu anhu in charge of gathering the Quran. Although the decision to appoint Zayd was hard, it was also obvious and inevitable, for Zayd radiallahu anhu possessed the very qualities that were needed for this very grand undertaking of gathering the Holy Quran. He possessed the impeccable character demanded by such a huge task. And so we went into a bit of detail over that process in that previous session a few weeks ago. We also talked about the lessons and morals to be learned from the apostate wars. We talked about how Islam became distinguished from all other religions and beliefs. We talked about the importance of having both a strong core group of Muslims and a well-protected homeland. And we also discussed there about preparing a new band of fighters and about the Islamic laws that pertain to apostasy being put into practice in this situation. Finally, in that previous session we started a new chapter on the conquest of Iraq, and we talked about the preparations for this conquest. And we had mentioned in that session about Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha from Shameem tribe. Earlier on in a previous session, he'd been introduced to the message of Islam, and he offered to support the Muslims from the side of the Arabs, but not from the side of the Persians, since they could not fight the Persians. Now, Al-Muthanna ibn Haritha is a Muslim, and he is the one going to the Khalifa, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, urging to allow him to fight against the Persians. So you can see how Islam changes the heart. Al-Muthanna's army couldn't fight the Persians alone, so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent reinforcements in the form of Khalid ibn Walid's army to join with Al-Muthanna's army. So that's about where we left off in the previous session. And today, inshallah, we're going to carry on talking about the conquest of Iraq. Just go to the next slide there. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa, he was a brilliant military strategist, as was displayed in his plans to invade Iraq. From Medina, he sent word to Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu anhu and Iyad radiallahu anhu, telling them what roads they should take to enter Iraq. Abu Bakr's plan was to have two armies attack Iraq, one from the southeast, and the other army was to attack from the opposite direction in the northwest of the country. Khalid ibn Walid's army was to attack from the southeast, starting from the area of Basra, also known as the gateway to India. Iyad bin Ghanam's army was to attack from the northwest. So it was a very precise plan laid out by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And yet in those days, of course, there weren't any maps or any of those sort of aids to help them with the geography of the land. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq gave instructions for both armies to attack towards the center of the country and meet up at a place called Al-Hira, which was in a very strategic position. It was very close to Al-Madhaar, the capital of the Persian Empire, located towards the Arabian Peninsula side. Also, in choosing Al-Hira as a meeting place between his two armies, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu showed a profound understanding of Iraq's geography. From a military perspective, Al-Hira was strategically perhaps the most important city in Iraq, and to take control of it was deemed a great victory. Al-Hira was important for a number of reasons. First, it was located near some of the major cities of Iraq. It was situated just 3 miles outside of Al-Kufa, and it would take a rider only a single day to travel from Al-Hira to Najf. Second, if one looked at a 7th century map of Iraq, one would find that Al-Hira connected all of the roads and traveling routes from all directions in Iraq. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he wanted the two armies to attack from the north and the south, and then to meet in the center of the country at Al-Hira, from where they could advance on the capital city. In his letter to Khalid ibn Walid, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he laid out his strategy. He said, when you've broken the Persian defenses and meet up at Al-Hira, and you are sure that the Muslims will not be attacked from behind, let one of you cover the Muslims by staying at Al-Hira, and let the other attack Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's enemy and your enemy in their own house in the place of their power. Al-Madain. Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu was to take control over the army bases in the south, and Iyad bin Ghanam was to approach from the desert in the north. Whoever arrived first in Al-Hira would be the Amir of the whole army and lead the army advance on Al-Madain, the capital of the Persian Empire, while the other stayed behind to protect the rear of that army. It was a very perfect strategy, one that kept the enemy engaged on two fronts. Furthermore, it allowed both Muslim armies to gather together in central Iraq and to so consolidate their forces and work as a team to completely bring down the enemy. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he aimed to advance and attack to the center of the oppressive Persian Empire and to cause its collapse. It was a very ambitious plan, considering that the Muslims had only just completed the apostasy wars, and then immediately, just straight after that, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he sends out these two armies, not for just some sort of cross-border incursions, but he sends them straight into the heart of the Persian Empire, the capital city, Al-Madain. Just going on to the slide here. Okay, so in his letters to his commanders, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he continually reiterated the importance of being gentle with and winning over the hearts of the masses of foreign citizens. They were not only Persians, but there were Arabs, and also the Persian Empire covered much of Asia. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he said, make peace with the people. Okay, so this was a very different attitude and a very different message to that which he sent his commanders during the apostasy wars, which we went into a lot of detail over previously. With the apostates, he said, whoever you catch, finish them off. But now, with the Persian Empire, he's saying, try to attract them, try to bring them close to Islam. If they were to answer his invitation, then all would be well. Otherwise, he was to take the jizya tax from them, a tax that is paid by non-Muslims living in Muslim lands, and it's a tax that enables non-Muslims to continue practicing their religion, and it further guarantees their safety and protection. The apostasy wars had a completely different objective to this war. The apostasy wars aimed to bring the Muslims back to the rule of Islam, while these wars in the foreign lands, they were aimed at people who had not previously caused any harm to the Muslims. The purpose of this advance on the Persian Empire was to spread Islam. And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, his message was, when you enter into Persia, try to attract the common people to Islam and bring them close to the Muslims. So again, the apostasy wars, they had a very different purpose to these wars of conquest, which were done to invite others to Islam, calling the people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Islam is tolerant towards non-Muslims living in Muslim lands. Lands where the rule of law is by Islam, where the land, its people are governed by the Muslims. But if they were to refuse to pay the jizya tax, Khalid radiallahu anhu was then to attack them. In his message, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he complicated the issue of recruiting soldiers, making it clear that Khalid radiallahu anhu was not to force anyone to take part in the expedition. So joining the army, it was voluntary. Even if they had previously fought against the apostates, they were not to be forced to fight against the Persians. And he explicitly forbade Khalid radiallahu anhu from enlisting people who had previously apostatized, even if they had now returned back to Islam, and even though he was in a critical need for reinforcements. While he didn't say why, it would be reasonable to consider that these people may falter in their intention at a critical stage of the battle. These were not wars of expansion and occupation to oppress foreigners. The common people in Persian lands, they were already victims of oppressive taxation. And these were not wars of piracy, plundering wealth and natural resources. These were wars to make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law predominate in the land, to wipe out oppressive governments and impose justice and equality among the people and bring the people to Islam. So people who had previously given up Islam, how could they go out and invite people to it? After coming back to Islam, the apostates didn't have sufficient time to prove themselves, even though today they were Muslims. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he didn't close off the topic completely. He finished by leaving the issue open, saying, until I make a decision otherwise. This was not a defensive war, but an offensive war. A defensive war, when the Muslims are under attack, everyone has to defend the Muslim community. So everyone in that case must fight. But the advance against the Persians was an offensive war, attacking someone else's land. So joining the army and fighting was voluntary, not compulsory. So no one who previously apostatized and no compulsion in joining the army made things quite difficult when assembling forces against the Persians. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq considered it to be the most appropriate way to deal with the problem. Subsequently, Khalid radiallahu anhu, he asked for more reinforcements. After just finishing a massive battle against the apostates, Khalid's soldiers, they were exhausted. So some of them, they were not prepared to go and fight again so quickly after the Battle of Al-Yamama. Khalid ibn Walid was one of those types who slept little and wouldn't allow others to sleep. He would always keep everyone busy. So who could Abu Bakr as-Siddiq send for reinforcements if he doesn't want to force anyone to go? He doesn't want the Murtaddin, or the apostates, to join, so he sends just one man. His name was Al-Qaqa' ibn Amr at-Tamimi. And the Khalifa, he was asked, are you sending a man whose troops are exhausted, just one man? Abu Bakr replied, an army doesn't lose when it contains the likes of this man. So instead of sending Khalid ibn Walid an army battalion as reinforcements, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he sends just this one man. When Khalid radiallahu anhu consolidated his forces and entered Iraq, he had 18,000 troops. He proceeded to send a letter giving da'wah to the people, which was the sunnah that every Muslim commander followed. Khalid radiallahu anhu wrote a letter to Hormuz, the leader of the Persian battalion that was stationed at Al-Ubla near Basra. It was a warning letter that contained the following message: to proceed, embrace Islam, and thereby achieve safety, or take protection for yourself and your people, and agree to pay the jizya tax. Otherwise, blame no one save yourself. For indeed, I have come to you with a people who love death just as you love life. Khalid radiallahu anhu invited Hormuz and his people to embrace Islam, in which case they would be entitled to the benefits that any other Muslim enjoyed, as well as bearing the responsibilities of being Muslims. In this letter, it was a form of psychological warfare through which Khalid radiallahu anhu hoped to instill fear into Hormuz's heart. After all, throughout history, it hasn't been often that an army met a foe that loved death more than life. And it was a very clear message which Hormuz rejected, and so he chose to fight. The resulting battle was called the Battle of Salasil, the Battle of Chains. It was called the Battle of Chains because the hearts of the enemy, they were so weak that they had to tie themselves to each other in chains so that they wouldn't run away from the fighting. And imagine trying to fight in chains. Then there were the Muslims who were so eager to die, you would need chains to hold them back from the fighting. Nothing else would stop them or slow them down. Before the battle commenced, Hormuz made camp beside the only source of water. When Khalid radiallahu anhu arrived, he had no water source, and so he was very clearly at a disadvantage. By the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His mercy, a single cloud appeared over the top of the Muslims that poured rain upon their rows of soldiers. They all drank from the rainwater and thus gained the strength that they needed to face the enemy. This occurrence, the appearance of a single cloud that poured rain down upon the Muslim army, is just one of many examples that illustrate the meaning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being with His true believing servants. Hormuz, an evil man, challenged Khalid to a duel. However, Hormuz had no intention of actually fighting against Khalid. He simply wanted to set a trap for him, to have him killed through treacherous means, and to demoralize the Muslims. Hormuz's guards, they quickly surrounded Khalid, while Al-Qaqqa' ibn Amr radiallahu anhu was watching every move of the enemy. Being well prepared, he, along with a group of Muslim horsemen, sprang into action once Hormuz's guards interrupted the duel. And that is when the fighting began in earnest. Al-Qaqqa' radiallahu anhu and his men handled Hormuz's guards, and Khalid killed Hormuz. And it was an absolutely disastrous defeat for the Persian army of Hormuz. Onto the Battle of Al-Madhaar. Khalid radiallahu anhu, he immediately moved on to Al-Madhaar. Khalid's army decisively beat the enemy during this battle. When the Persian emperor learned about his army's defeat at Al-Madhaar, he realized that he had a major crisis on his hands, one that could potentially lead to the destruction of his entire empire. In view of that, he sent out a huge army, and so as not to take any chances, he dispatched a second huge army as well. When Khalid learned about the size of the army, he decided that it would be best to attack the enemy from 3 directions, hoping that might help to break up the huge army. And this was known as the Battle of Al-Walja. Khalid's plan was quite brilliant, and it incorporated the element of surprise, and it gave the Muslims at least a fighting chance, provided that they could succeed in breaking up the huge army of the Persians. In order to protect the rear of his army, Khalid radiallahu anhu ordered Suwayd bin Mukrin to stay behind at Al-Hudayr. Then he led the rest of his army towards Al-Walja. When the fighting began in earnest, Khalid radiallahu anhu and the men of his division met the enemy head-on. Meanwhile, the 2 other divisions of the Muslim army were hiding at a short distance from the battlefield. When the time was right, those divisions attacked the enemy fighters, taking them by surprise. Khalid's plan worked brilliantly, and the enemy was genuinely taken by surprise. The momentum turned in the favor of the Muslims, and the Persian soldiers, they were soon forced to concede defeat. And so they fled from the scene of the battle, and those among them that did manage to escape ended up dying of thirst in the desert. In his victory speech, Khalid radiallahu anhu encouraged the Muslims to spend little time in Arab lands and to stay as much as possible in foreign lands. He said to his soldiers, "Do you not see the great variety of foods here? By Allah Ta'ala, had fighting in the way of Allah Ta'ala and inviting others to Islam not been obligatory upon us, and had we been here only for worldly gain, it would still be wise for us to stay here and take control of this countryside." So these words of Khalid, they carried a profound meaning. For one thing, he was hinting at the fact that during the pre-Islamic days of ignorance, when the Arabs stayed in Arabia, they would not seek out the hereafter, nor were they successful in a worldly sense. Instead, they were a misguided and divided people who were constantly at war amongst themselves. But now, things were different. Essentially, Khalid radiallahu anhu, he was encouraging them to stay and to continue fighting. This was a very noble cause. They were not fighting to gain the wealth of the enemy. Wealth accumulated as a byproduct of the struggle. When the battle was over, Khalid radiallahu anhu, as per his usual practice, divided the captured wealth into 5 parts. 4 of those parts he distributed among his soldiers, and the last part he sent back to the Khalifa Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. The Battle of Ullais. This battle consisted of a very powerful Christian Arab and Persian alliance, which severely underestimated the strength of Khalid's men. Very many soldiers were killed by Khalid and his army in the resulting defeat. When the war booty and the news of Khalid's many victories reached Medina, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq exclaimed, "O group of Muslims, your lion, that is Khalid, has attacked another lion and has taken away from it its piece of meat. Indeed, women are now failing to give birth to the likes of Khalid." In other words, women now cannot give birth to such a person. The conquest of Al-Hira and Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, he wasn't only good at fighting, but he was also good with diplomacy. On many occasions, he caused people to surrender and give up without fighting. In Al-Hira, he negotiated with the chiefs of 4 fortresses, and they were Christian Arabs. As usual, he gave them the 3 options of becoming Muslims, paying the jizya tax, or fighting. And they decided to pay the jizya. Khalid said to them, "May you be destroyed, woe upon you. Verily disbelief is a desert pathway that leads one astray, and it is only the most foolish of Arabs that travel by it." So they insisted, and they didn't want to become Muslims. Based on this account, it's clear that Khalid's primary goal was to invite people to Islam, to guide people to the truth. Glory, the gaining of more property, becoming rich, enjoying life, none of these things mattered to Khalid ibn Walid. In war, he sought martyrdom, and in peace, he desired nothing more than to guide others to the truth. Why else did he become angry when the people of Al-Hira agreed to pay the jizya tax? After all, that they agreed to pay the jizya tax benefited the Muslims by adding riches to the Muslim treasury, and that on a yearly basis. The Muslims would have been more wealthy if others did not become Muslims. But worldly prosperity meant nothing to Khalid, a man who wanted more than anything else to gain what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had in store for his obedient servants, paradise and an eternal life of bliss, comfort and happiness. The Prophet ﷺ said, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide a single man through you is better for you than for you to own red camels. And a person who owned red camels in those times was like a millionaire in our times. So they wrote out a contract, and based on that agreement, they would not embrace Islam, but instead they would pay the jizya tax at a rate of 190,000 dirhams, payable each year from those who were working, including monks and priests who are working, with the exception of those people who have no work and are cut off from the worldly life, or travellers. So this referred to people such as monks in monasteries living a simple life, abstaining from worldly pleasures. In return for that, they could remain upon their religion. Furthermore, by agreeing to pay the jizya tax, the people of Al-Hira were to receive a guarantee of safety and protection from the Muslim government, protection even from third parties such as foreign invaders. Khalid radiallahu anhu went on to say that if the Muslim government failed to protect them, they would no longer have to pay the jizya tax, at least not until the Muslims again fulfilled their part of their agreement. And that was by protecting them. So the Muslims, they would return their money to them until such time as protection could be once again guaranteed. Finally, Khalid pointed out that if the people of Al-Hira would act treacherously towards the Muslims or breach their agreement with them, the entire agreement would be considered null and void. And just having a little computer problem here. Okay, so Khalid pointed out that if the people of Al-Hira would act treacherously towards the Muslims or breach their agreement with them, the entire agreement would be considered null and void. And this agreement was written in the month of Rabi'un al-Awwal in the 12th Hijri year. Khalid then sent back a share of the war booty to Medina, and along with that wealth, the people of Al-Hira, they sent expensive gifts for the Khalifa Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Upon receiving the gifts, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu felt that it was highly inappropriate for him to accept them. It was the way of foreign leaders to lay claim to expensive gifts from the people they conquered. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he didn't want to establish the same precedent in Islam. Instead, he wanted to be just, fair, and kind with the people that he conquered. So instead of accepting the expensive gifts, he added them to the pile of war booty that had arrived from Al-Hira. So now the new base for the Muslims was Al-Hira. Khalid sent out letters from Al-Hira to the Persian leaders. After centuries of relative stability, the Persian Empire was now thrown into a state of chaos. Muslim forces had invaded their territory and had succeeded in taking control of much of their land. Battle after battle was lost to the Muslim armies, and there was no sign of a shift in momentum to indicate that the empire could be saved. Khalid was aware of infighting that was taking place amongst Persia's most powerful class of people. Wanting to take advantage of the situation, Khalid radiallahu anhu, he wrote the following letter to the noble men and leaders of Persia. From Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu to the kings of Persia, to proceed. All praise is for Allah Ta'ala, who has undone your government, weakened your ability to plot, divided you, weakened you, taken away your wealth, and stripped from you your honor. When this letter of mine reaches you, embrace Islam, and you will have achieved safety. Otherwise, take a covenant of protection from us and pay the jizya tax. If you say no to that, then by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I will come to you with a people who love death just as you love life, and who are desirous of the hereafter just as you are desirous of this world. Khalid wanted them to become Muslims so he could move on and give da'wah to the other people. When the Persian kings received this letter, they were shocked. They considered the Arabs as weak people coming out of a desolate land, and then suddenly they're coming over here telling us to become Muslims or pay them taxes. So this letter, it made the Persian leaders very angry. The leaders in the Persian Empire were very proud and arrogant, and so they tore Khalid's letter into pieces. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses Khalid radiallahu anhu with a miracle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded Khalid for his strong faith by granting him this miracle. During his stay in Iraq, Khalid spent some time with a man named Amr bin Abdul Masih, who was the leader of his people. One day Khalid, he was with Amr, and accompanying them was one of Amr's slaves. Noticing a bag around the slave's neck, Khalid took hold of it and emptied its contents, finding among other things a vial. Khalid then said, "O Amr, what is this?" Amr replied, "This is poison that can kill its victim within the period of 1 hour." When Khalid then asked him why he was carrying poison, Amr explained that he was afraid that Khalid and his men would turn out to be contrary to the positive image he had of them, and that he preferred dying by taking the poison to seeing evil befall his people. He further said that his time to die had come, explaining to Amr that it was not up to him to decide when his time to die had come. Khalid radiallahu anhu said, "Verily, no person dies until his divinely decreed time arrives." Or in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed a specific time for each person to die, and no one dies until his specific decreed time arrives. Next, Khalid did something that took everyone around him by complete surprise. He held the vial of poison in his hand and he said, "Bismillah, in the name of Allah Ta'ala," and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of names, the Lord of the earth and the Lord of the heavens. Lo, with the mention of his name, no disease can cause harm. He is the most beneficent and the most merciful. Having said these words, Khalid, he raised the vial to his mouth quickly with the intention of swallowing its contents, and those who were with him at the time, they tried to stop him, but they were too late. He'd already swallowed the poison. And based on the potency of the poison, Khalid, he should have died within the period of 1 hour. But because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings, and then Khalid's faith, the poison had no harmful effect on him whatsoever. Having been a first-hand witness to this miracle, Amr was shocked, and he said, by Allah Ta'ala, O group of Arabs, you will rule over whatever lands you wish as long as you continue to have among you someone from this generation, meaning from the generation of the Prophet's companions. This was a very amazing miracle which had been quoted. It's been quoted by those who are foremost in hadith criticism, like At-Tabari, Ibn Sa'd, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Hajar, and Ibn Taymiyyah. And they never mentioned any weakness in this hadith. When Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu did that, he was at a superior level of yaqeen, or certainty of faith. He would never have attempted to take poison knowing it may kill him, because then that would have been suicide, which is forbidden in Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired him that he would not be harmed, and that his dua is the sword that will destroy the enemy. Dua is like a sword, in that if it's in a weak hand, we say that we make dua, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't respond to our dua. But the problem is not in the dua, it is with the person making it. Because dua is like a sword, it's very sharp. The problem is with the one carrying the sword. Some people are strong and they can use it, but others, they cannot. The problem lies with the holder of the sword. Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, he had that certainty of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He makes dua, makes dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and swallows. And the poison cannot harm him. The conquest of Al-Anbaar, and the first part of Khalid's mission in Iraq was now accomplished. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had ordered Khalid and Iyad to compete with one another to see who could first reach Al-Hira. Khalid was to enter from the southern part of Iraq and Iyad from the north. In the end, it was Khalid who reached Al-Hira first, after having conquered all of the opposition that stood in his way. Iyad, on the other hand, he was not successful. He was having a hard time with the enemy at a place called Daumatul Jandal. For this reason, Khalid ibn Walid, he decided to leave Al-Hira and try his best to help Iyad and the members of his army. Having placed Al-Qaqqa ibn Amr at-Tamimi in charge of Al-Hira, Khalid headed northwards. But along the way, his mission was interrupted by enemy fighters in a city called Al-Anbaar. Rather than continue northwards, Khalid he decided to gain control of Al-Anbaar and to thus protect the rear of his army from an ambush. After a short siege, the leader of Al-Anbaar surrendered. The same thing happened at Ain at-Tamr. Khalid was successful. And at Daumatul Jandal, the people there, they had two leaders, Al-Uqaydir and Al-Jawdi. And the two of them disagreed about how they should deal with Khalid ibn Walid. Uqaydir was the more frightened of the two, and he had every reason to be frightened considering his past experience with Khalid ibn Walid. The two of them first met during the Tabuk expedition. Khalid, based on the instructions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, captured Uqaydir and took him back to the Muslim encampment. Rather than kill or punish Uqaydir, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam set him free, but not before taking a covenant from him. Uqaydir later he broke the terms of that covenant by turning against the Muslims. And from that day onwards, because of how he had betrayed the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he lived in a constant state of fear, knowing that his betrayal would sooner or later catch up with him and be the cause of his demise. Uqaydir got the news of Khalid's approaching army and decided to run away. Khalid, upon hearing of Uqaydir's nearby presence, ordered Asim bin Amr to search for and to capture him. It didn't take long for Asim to locate and capture Uqaydir, And when they returned to the Muslim army, Khalid gave the order for Uqaydir to be executed. It was a just punishment considering Uqaydir's history of betrayal and treachery. Khalid radiallahu anhu then achieved a very quick victory. By conquering Daumatul Jandal, the Muslims gained control of a city whose strategic importance was immeasurable. Daumatul Jandal was at the crossroads between Arabia, the Roman Empire, and the Persian Empire. Khalid, he went on to achieve victory also in the following battles. The Battle of Al-Ullais, the Battle of Al-Musayyakh, and in that battle, Adi bin Hatim radiallahu anhu, who was one of the Muslim soldiers during the raids, he later recalled, "We reached a man whose name was Harqus, and at the time he was surrounded by his sons, daughters, and wife. He placed before them a bowl of alcohol, upon which they said, 'Will anyone drink this hour at a time when Khalid's armies have arrived?' He replied, 'Drink a farewell drink, for I do not think that you will ever have another drink again after it.' Adi then went on to say, as Harqus was saying that, and as he was about to drink some of the alcohol, a group of horsemen rode by, striking his head at the moment his head was inside the bowl. We then took his daughters and killed his sons." The Battle of Al-Firaad, Khalid then, he was in the land between the Persians and the Romans, between Syria and Iraq, when he reached this place called Al-Firaad. This battle, it isn't well known in the history, but it's very critical because it's when Khalid radiallahu anhu met a coalition of the two superpowers alongside the puppet Arab governments of the time. So there was the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Arab tribes of Taghlib, Ayad, and Namr. And before crossing over the Euphrates River, the leaders of the opposing army, they questioned whether it was wise to fight Khalid. In the end, however, these words fell upon deaf ears. Too many people were bent upon seeking revenge, and so, after receiving encouragement from their leaders, Roman, Persian, and Arab Christian soldiers, they crossed the Euphrates and fought in a battle that was both long and fiercely contested. In spite of the enthusiasm shown by Persian, Roman, and Arab fighters, they were no match for Khalid's army. During the battle, a single Muslim would gather a number of enemy soldiers with a spear and kill them all. Such was the bravery of the Muslim soldiers and the terror they inspired in the hearts of their enemy. Khalid ibn Walid inspired so much fear in the hearts of his enemies because they knew even if they withdrew and retreated from the battlefield, Khalid would track them down and pursue them until they were killed. So some of the enemy, they were already shaking at the thought of Khalid before the battle even started because of his reputation in winning so many battles. And then he swallowed that poison and nothing happened. And then there was the rumor that went around the enemy that Khalid's sword was from the heavens. And they misunderstood his nickname, the sword of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to mean he received a sword from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the Battle of Al-Firaad, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers died that day. After the conclusion of the battle, Khalid stayed in Firaad for 10 days, after which he returned to Al-Hira. And the events of this battle, they took place in the middle of Dhul Qa'dah in the 12th Hijri year. And the Muslims, they had fared very well in a great number of previous battles. But this one was different. The victory at Al-Firaad was extra special because victory was achieved in spite of the fact that Khalid's army was facing three enemies, the Romans, the Persians, as well as the Arabs. To be sure, the Battle of Al-Firaad is considered a decisive battle in the history of Islam, even though it's not well known like the major battles that took place during the same period.